Today on the Crit House, Brooks Jensen, a fine art photographer, publisher, workshop leader, and writer whose impact on the world of photography is undeniable. With his late wife Maureen Gallagher, Brooks founded LensWork, the award-winning periodical that has been a cornerstone of the art photography community for over 31 years. As the editor and publisher, his vision continues shaping how we experience photography today. Brooks' personal work shines through on his ongoing series Kokoro, a unique PDF-based publication available for download. He's the author of 9 best-selling books on photography and creativity, including Trilogies in 2022 and Light, Glorious Light in 2023. Brooks Jensen's myFIVE images include work from Bullock, Wright Morris, Oliver Gagliani, Hokusai, and Charles Dickens. Brooks Jensen, thank you for joining us on the Crit House to talk about 5 images that have been influential to you as a creative and as a person. It's an honor to have you on the program.
Well, my pleasure to be here. I've watched a number of your videos, and you're doing a really great thing. I love what you're doing.
Well, I do this because you're a professional and you're experienced, but I'm just a hack. I'm an amateur trying to learn. And I tell you what, these conversations for me are so educational. I learn so much from people like you, telling just giving the stories of what was influential, what was important, and how it influenced them as well. So that's why I'm always so honored with people like you who come on who have so much experience and are so talented to help me understand how to be a photographer.
And just so we get it out of the way right off the bat, my favorite f-stop is 8, because if you take 8 and rotate it sideways, it becomes infinity.
Oh, okay. It wasn't a question I was going to ask.
That's great.
So tell us about yourself, about who you are as a photographer or as a professional or a photo person. Introduce the audience to Brooks Jensen.
Well, I started serious photography, I guess you'd call it, personally expressive fine art photography, if you want to get technical, about 50 years ago. I met my wife, Maureen, in 1992. She was a photographer, and she said, "Gee, what magazines do you subscribe to?" Well, interesting question between 2 photographers. I said, "I don't subscribe to any magazines because fundamentally I'm not interested in cameras, and camera magazines are all about cameras. I'm
Right.
interested in images." And she said, "Well, what magazine would you subscribe to if you could?" And I said, I don't even have to tell you, I can show you. And I pulled off my bookshelf one of the very early Aperture magazines when Minor White was publishing them in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And she said, "Well, is there a magazine like that now?" And I said, "Well, Aperture's still around, but it's gotten commercial and glossy and et cetera." And she said, "Well, why don't we do one?" So we started publishing LensWork in 1993. I've said for ever since then that I was a photographer first and a publisher second. And now that I've been publishing 31 years, looking back, it's been such an incredible adventure with podcasts and meeting people and flying all over the world. And it's a great reason to be a photographer is look at all the wonderful people you get to meet.
So you were given this task of choosing 5 images in the myFIVE series. What did you go through in deciding on what those 5 images were going to be?
Well, like I suppose everybody you've talked to, I wish you had given us like 500 images that we could choose from because there are so many. And of course, one of the great things about being involved in photography is you discover new ones. Well, maybe not every day, but pretty damn close to every
Yes.
day because
Yeah.
there's so much great photography being done now and throughout history. With the internet now, we can find so much. So for me, it was an interesting challenge to pick only 5. Curiously enough, I had done a project called Those Who Inspire Me and Why, which is which started off to be a book. And then I decided to take advantage of today's technology and I published it as an audio book instead. It's on our website at LensWork Online. And so I just went and looked at those 63 people that I'd already talked about and really reviewed them because it's been several years since I did that project. And I thought, it's not so much the images, is it's the impact of sometimes philosophy, sometimes theory, sometimes imagery. And so, when I narrowed it down, I came up with five that was kind of a surprise to me, if the truth were known.
Well, that's a good transition. Let's go take a look at those 5 images.
Okay.
And we start with the wave from Hokusai.
Well, this is probably one of the most famous pieces of artwork in all of history. It shows up everywhere, and it's used commercially now. It's a Japanese what's called an ukiyo-e print, a woodblock print. And like everybody else, I'd seen this one many, many, many times. But it wasn't until I saw another Hokusai item, which is the next slide, that it really struck me what this was all about, and that is capturing the moment. Now, as a photographer, I had always tended to zero in on photographing either things, grand landscapes, or people. But when I really looked at Hokusai's work, I realized that his work was all about capturing a moment, which is, of course, what we do with photography too. It's just that when you capture a thousandth of a second of someone staring back at the camera, it's not really a moment. It's a slice of life, I guess. But to me, photographing moments became more and more important the more I studied the Japanese ukiyo-e prints.
And so you have provided us with some images that reference the influence, and this is one of them that you say references or was influenced perhaps by Hokusai.
Yeah, this was fairly close to where I live, and I was photographing a seagull sitting on a post. I mean, how more cliche could you get? And fortunately, the seagull took off and was flying so close to this turbulent water that it just felt like danger could happen at any minute. Of course, we have the orca whales up there in the Pacific Northwest and whatnot, and I thought, this is the kind of thing that I might see in a Hokusai print. And I find this a very difficult kind of photography to do because you have to be very, very lucky. But when it works, it's great.
There is something impending doom about the blackness of the water and the roiling water that's there. Yeah, I see that.
Right.
Yeah. Your second image from photographer Win Bullock.
Yeah, Win Bullock is a really fantastic, one of the greatest photographers in history, but generally doesn't get acknowledged as great as Edward Weston or Ansel Adams or some of those others. And I think it has to do with the fact that Win Bullock didn't photograph things or people as much as he photographed metaphors. And when you look at so many of his images, you really have to delve into his world of metaphor. The title of this image is called Navigation Without Numbers. And you see that it's the title of a book on the far right-hand edge of the screen.
Yes.
And so that title fits so well with this unwed mother who had this child in the 50s, and they're in a little cabin where she was living at the time, and it just is so evocative of the challenges of not only her and her life, but now this little baby in his life or her life. I'm not sure if it's a boy or a girl, but growing up, that's what we do is we navigate without numbers. And I saw this image very early in my photographic life, and it was a puzzle. And I think it was a puzzle because I didn't understand that it was a metaphor. And it wasn't until much later, and I heard things like Minor White would say so famously, don't photograph what it is, photograph what else it is. Well, that's the metaphor kind of idea. And so this is not just a portrait of a woman, it's a portrait of a metaphor. And I think it's marvelous.
So you say that, and I've talked a little bit about how this is my education. That's one of the leaps that I'm trying to understand with my photography, is to not photograph what it is, because
Mhm.
that's what I do. I mean, I'm out there shooting light and moments, but um, I struggle with that, with the meaning and metaphor and something that is more than just that particular image. So I love that you talked about that. We had another person on, Sig Harvey, who was on earlier this year, and she talked about that as well. I'll link to that for you viewers out there who missed it. But thanks for saying that. It was very well put as well. And then we have this Win Bullock image.
No, this
No,
is
this
one
is
of mine.
you. Oh, well,
This is
hey,
one of mine that is an example of a metaphor. This was actually a tidal slough down on the Washington coast. You know how the water will come in and out every 6 hours with the tide, and it brings a bunch of stuff with it. And this was a very bland, sort of awful green, yucky photograph that for some reason I felt compelled to take, but I wasn't aware what was going on in my mind, and that's where the metaphor stuff sometimes kicks in. Is that your subconscious is reacting in ways that we may not be sensitive to. So I photographed this place for hours. I made hundreds of photographs,
yeah,
and eventually I took this one and I made it extremely contrasty. I pushed the contrast much harder than I would ever normally do it. And suddenly this thing became the night sky
the night sky and
and,
starlight. Yeah,
and this Medusa-like thing in it. And it became a project I called Worlds Within Worlds. And there were a number of these kinds of images, and I gave them all nebula names. So this is the Medusa Nebula.
love it. Now you sent this one along as well with
Same thing.
yeah,
This is also, for me anyway, a metaphor because when I saw this uh, bilaterally symmetric group of trees, it felt like they were reaching. It didn't feel like
yeah,
trees just being there. There was a worship sort of feeling to this. And so that again to me is the idea of trying to capture a metaphor. It's not just trees and the moon, but there's something else going on. Again, that doesn't happen very often with photography because the cameras are so good at taking a picture of what something looks like
yeah.
that what we have to do is try to move beyond that. And that's not always easy, but when you find one, it's great fun.
Well, like I say, that's the leap I'm trying to figure out how to make. This looks to me almost like a satellite dish. It's
It does to me.
which is also reaching, right? It's trying to
Yep.
sort of contact out to the
Yep.
celestial space. Now, we talk to people about artistic influences, and you have gone away from photography with your third artist, with Charles Dickens.
Yeah, Charles Dickens is a fascinating study in the creative life, and I'm very interested in that, and I've read a lot about that, and I love Charles Dickens' writing. But one of the interesting aspects of his career was that when he was young in his 20s, before he was quote unquote Charles Dickens, before he was famous, he worked for a newspaper. And the newspaper knew that he was very, very keen on observing life. So they sent him out into the streets and said, uh, draw word pictures, if you will, paint in words things that you find out there in the world for our newspaper. And so he found scenes. Think of scene as in SCENE,
Yes.
that kind of, and he would describe them in some detail. Maybe it was a Hackney coach stand, or it was some kind of a party, a birthday party or something. And he would just describe it and people's expressions in their face. And he would put together whole bunches of observations into a 1,500 or 2,500 word sketch, is what he called them, sketch. Those eventually got all combined and published in a book titled Sketches by Boz. Boz was his pen name at the time before he used Charles Dickens. But when I thought about what he was doing, I realized there was this perfect parallel with what you and I try to do with photography. We go out into the world and we look for a scene that we can somehow then describe so that people who aren't there can can have the experience of being there standing next to us or something. And when I dissected several of his stories or essays, I realized that he would have a description of this individual and the clothes they were wearing, and a description of this individual and their motions. And I thought that feels like a multiple image project. And believe it or not, it was Charles Dickens that got me thinking about trying to put together 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 pictures that put together a small story that doesn't have a plot. There's not a beginning, middle, and end. It's not a morality tale or anything. It's just a look at life. And so here's an example. There was a rodeo in the town where I lived up near the Canadian border, and I thought, what could I do with a rodeo? And it dawned on me that having been to rodeos, that everybody goes to a rodeo and wears their brand new white straw hat. It's a thing in the rodeo world. So I put together a small project from where I sat in the stands. I never moved a foot. All I did was use a fairly long lens to find ways to photograph various people in their rodeo hats. It's a multiple image project to make a sketch that's not really a story, but kind of is a story. And I've been doing lots and lots and lots of these thanks to the inspiration by Charles Dickens.
That's a great way of looking at things. So one of the things that I'm also doing at the moment is trying to figure out, like, if I am putting together a zine of some of my street work and to sequence it so that there's some kind of a story, but maybe it doesn't have to be that sort of broad epic tale as much as it is some smaller descriptions of a scene.
Well, the problem is the word story.
Yeah.
When you think of story, you think beginning, middle, and end,
Hmm.
and there's got to be some kind of plot that reaches a denouement. And, that can be done with photography, but what a camera is really terrific for is just observing these kinds of small details. I went to the rodeo thinking I'd photograph the rodeo.
Right.
But when I got there and I saw all the white hats, I quickly shifted gears and thought, no, I don't have to tell the rodeo story. I could tell this smaller story and have something really fun with a half a dozen images.
Love it. It's good to be nimble.
Yeah,
We
right,
we move on to Wright Morris.
right. Wright Morris has been very influential for me because I love photographing nostalgia, and Wright Morris did that. He did it very well. I first discovered his work when the Friends of Photography did a monograph of his work, and this picture was the cover of that monograph. But what's fascinating to me about Wright Morris is that he's more known as a novelist, not as a photographer. And he went to his family's farm. I think it was in Nebraska. Don't quote me on that. It might have been South Dakota or somewhere, Kansas, something. Anyway, he went there in the early 50s, I think it was, and spent the summer photographing his grandparents on the farm. Then he came back, had all these wonderful pictures, and he wrote a fictional story that was not about his grandparents, but used those images or some of those images in a book called The Home Place. Then he used some of the same images and others from that summer of photography and wrote a completely separate story called The Inhabitants. These are totally fictional. He's a novelist, right? He's writing novels with pictures. And then he came back later and did a third one called God's Country and My People, all using the same images from one summer. And sometimes the same image shows up in all three books. And I thought it was a revelation because keep in mind the way that so many of us in the last half of the 19th century were taught photography was you made a beautiful picture, you matted, you framed it, you hung it on the wall. It was beautiful. It was decor. But the idea of using photography to supplement fictional stories and bring them to visual life was something I'd never heard of. And so his inspiration made me start thinking less about being a photographer and more about being a storyteller. And when you perceive yourself and you think of yourself as a storyteller, boy, the world opens up because now you don't have to go to Yosemite and photograph something beautiful. You can go down the street to the 7-Eleven and make a story. And and I owe all of that to Wright Morris, even though he was more known as a novelist than a photographer.
I actually I don't know him as a novelist. I know him as a photographer, maybe because I don't read as much as I should. Um, but the idea that he's inspired by his own art. I
Mhm.
mean, we're kind of looking for I am looking for inspiration in the artists that we're talking about, but he's getting it from himself to come up with something creative that he hadn't thought about
Yeah.
previously. That's
And it's the whole idea of image and text
yeah.
that fascinates me too, which sort of ties back to the Charles Dickens idea. But he did the silverware, so I wanted to do some silverware too. But I couldn't just make a picture of silverware because it would be kind of copying Wright Morris. So I thought, what am I going to do with this? What does this mean to me? How do I feel about this? So I created this project called We Accept This Food, and it's all about the ritual of prayer over food
Oh,
from all kinds of different cultures. And so I found the Sioux Indian prayer for the acceptance of food, and the Buddhist prayer, and the Hindu prayer, and the Christian prayer, and all these, and turned this into a little PDF, all using sort of my what do I want to call it? My homage, that's a better word than ripoff, of Wright Morris's images. But this
inspiration.
is what it meant to me, is it wasn't just pretty pictures of silverware in a drawer, but I tried to extend it into something that had to do with people's lives so that they could relate to it more tangibly.
Yeah, love it.
These are some of the other images from it.
Yeah. I love the idea that you seem to have been doing through your career of taking ideas and making something of it. Um, it's there's something that's just inherently inspiring about doing that. Because I wrestle with that. I mean, I wrestle with that as a person who sometimes calls himself a photographer because I don't know. I didn't grow up in a world of art and having
Mhm.
those sort of inspirations. So I love that you're doing that, and I love that you're telling me about where those inspirations came from for you as well.
Mhm.
Now, this photographer I am not familiar with, so tell me about Oliver Gagliani.
Oliver Gagliani was a contemporary of Ansel Adams and a little younger, I think, than Edward Weston. He lived in San Francisco, so he was part of that scene. But you probably haven't heard of him because Oliver didn't spend much time promoting. He didn't he wasn't particularly interested in developing a career
Mhm.
as a fine art photographer. He just wanted to make images, and there's only a few books of his work. He passed away a number of years ago, but he told me an interesting story. We published him in LensWork, and I got to know him pretty well before he died. And he told me this fascinating story about this image, that he had been invited to be a co-instructor with Ansel Adams at one of the Yosemite workshops. And on the way up to Yosemite, he stopped at the camera store to buy some film and whatnot. And he saw that they had this new film called Tech Pan, which was a very high contrast film. And he'd never used it before, never seen it before. But he bought a few rolls just for fun. And when he got up there to Yosemite, he thought he was going to make pictures of the waterfalls and the rocks and, all the things that we all do. But what fascinated him were the patches on the camping tents.
Huh.
Those old-fashioned canvas tents
Yeah,
that the bears would come into the campgrounds and tear them open
get the
with
food.
their claws, and then the forest rangers and whatnot would put patches on the tents, and they were, gray tents, so that they didn't have much contrast. And he thought, hey, this is a perfect thing to use with this Tech Pan film because it'll increase the contrast tremendously. So he spent the entire week photographing the patches on the tents while he was in Yosemite. And I thought that is such an absolutely marvelous story because to me, what it illustrates, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is that creativity, the magic of creativity, is not in the subject, it's in the photographer
Yeah.
who searches for subjects that they can do something with. So rather than spending his time making pretty pictures of Half Dome and whatnot, he created this body of work that was it had, I don't know, he probably had 25 or 30 images in this portfolio, and this was one of my favorites. And uh, by sheer coincidence, sometime later, it was, matter of fact, only 3 or 4 years ago, I was driving around, photographing out with my camera and whatnot, and I saw a patch that looked almost exactly like this on one of those great big bales of hay that are encased in
Right,
white
right, right.
plastic. They look
Wrapped
like
up.
giant marshmallows. And so I did this little project called I Remembered Oliver, or Remembering Oliver, I guess it was the creative eye. And I photographed all those plastic marshmallow things. I don't even know what you call them,
I don't
plastic
either. Yeah.
containers that they wrap up hay in. And I thought they were fantastic. But to me, it's the great gift from Oliver, and why it was such an inspiration was to see how he did not approach the world to make the expected cliche or the expected pretty picture. He approached the world to find out what was there and then figure out what he could make with it. So this is the one that I saw in the plastic that reminded me so much of Oliver's. And so in this little project of a dozen images plus or minus, I basically told this story about Oliver and his creativity and how that inspired me to look at the world, not to go photographing the expected, but to go photographing the things that we see that impress us and to try to have open eyes.
It is the thing of our conversation. I've got a lot of things from this conversation with you, but the one that makes me the happiest is this idea that a person went to Yosemite alongside Ansel Adams. And I've never been to Yosemite, but as I understand, it's one of the great, beautiful wonders of our
Oh, it
country and the
is.
and the
It is.
world. And then to take the time that you're there to be to be photographing the canvas on tents as
I
opposed to
know.
those great wonders. It gives me great joy that somebody found that creative inspiration, not of Half Dome and the waterfalls, but of these small patches. That makes me happy.
But if you look at Hokusai and Win Bullock and Charles Dickens and Wright Morris and Gagliani, they all did that. They didn't go out and seek out the spectacular. They went out and found what touched them somehow, that they became sensitive to what they were able to find, and that's what made them interesting artists.
Brooks Jensen, thank you so much for joining us here on the Crit House, a photographer and a publisher, and have you been influencing photographers for a long time as well? It really is an honor to have you join us, so thank you very much.
Thanks, I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yeah, it has been very much fun. And thank you all for watching the Crit House.